Welcome back to Disturbed Reality. The pervasive influence of Mexican drug cartels extends beyond the realms of illicit trade and violence, deeply impacting the social fabric of communities. One of the most distressing aspects of their operations is the exploitation and victimization of children. This video, while hard to make due to the case in question, aims at exploring the multifaceted ways in which Mexican drug cartels utilize and harm children, examining the underlying factors, methods of exploitation, and the profound consequences on young lives and society at large. The recruitment and exploitation of young people by drug cartels is driven by a complex interplay of socio-economic factors. High levels of poverty, lack of education, limited employment opportunities, and the pervasive presence of violence creates an environment where children are especially vulnerable. In many communities, the absence of a strong state presence and the allure of quick financial gains make joining cartels an attractive, albeit a dangerous option for survival. One of the most horrifying roles children are forced into is that of armed combatants. Cartels train young boys as hitmen, sicarios, teaching them how to use firearms and execute violent tasks. These child soldiers are often used in high-risk operations due to their perceived expendability and the shock value that their involvement brings. Children are also used as drug couriers and lookouts due to their ability to evade law enforcement suspicion more easily than adults. They often transport drugs across borders and within cities, often at great personal risk. Lookouts, known as halcones, are stationed in strategic locations to monitor police activities and alert the cartel of any potential threats. Cartels engage in human trafficking, forcing young people into labor and even sexual exploitation. Young girls are particularly vulnerable to being trafficked for prostitution. The psychological and physical trauma inflicted upon these children is profound, leaving lasting scars. The involvement of children in cartel activities has devastating psychological and social consequences. Exposure to extreme violence and participation in criminal acts lead to severe trauma, including PTSD, depression, and substance abuse. The normalization of violence erodes their moral and ethical frameworks, making rehabilitation almost impossible. Socially, the exploitation of children by cartels completely destabilizes and undermines communities. Families are torn apart, schools become unsafe, and the cycle of poverty and violence perpetrates as young people are continuously drawn into the criminal underworld. The long-term societal impact includes a generation of youth disconnected from legal and productive societal norms. As bad as things are now, it wasn't always this way with Mexican drug cartels. During the 1980s, where the Mexican drug trade was controlled primarily by the Guadalajara cartel, while they were no strangers to carrying out violent acts, as well as displaying ruthless behaviour, there was still an semblance of rules, similar to the mafia, where women and children were largely viewed as out of bounds and unacceptable. During the late 80s, the cartel's power would begin to diminish following the arrest of prominent leaders, and in 1989, the cartel would become officially disbanded following the arrest of its main leader, the Godfather, Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo, El Padrino. Prior to his arrest, Felix Gallardo convened the nation's top drug narcos at a house in the resort city of Acapulco, where he designated the plazas or territories. The restructure of the Guadalajara cartel was due to increased pressure from law enforcement following the murder of DEA agent Kiki Camarena in February of 1985. Different drug lords were given a certain region where they could traffic drugs into the USA, and tax smugglers that wished to move merchandise on their turf. The Tijuana route would go to his nephews, the Arellano Felix brothers, the brothers eventually forming the Tijuana cartel. The Ciudad Juarez route would go to the Carrillo Fuentes family, headed by the nephew of Fonseca Carrillo, Amado Carrillo Fuentes. This alliance would go on to become the Juarez cartel. Miguel Caro Quintero would run the Sonora corridor. Control of the Matamoros and Tamaulipas corridor would be left undisturbed to Juan Garcia Abregu, leader of the Gulf Cartel. Meanwhile, Joaquin El Chapo Guzman and Ismael Zambada Garcia would take over the Pacific Coast operations, eventually becoming the Sinaloa Cartel. Guzman and Zambada would then bring veteran trafficker Hector Luis Palma Salazar back into the fold to help with operations. Felix Gallardo still planned to oversee national operations, as he had the contacts, so he was still the top man, but he would be no longer in control of all details of the business, therefore becoming more of a shadow leader. Following El Padrino's arrest in 1989, his restructuring of the Guadalajara cartel actually contributed to the creation of several new cartels, including the Sinaloa cartel as well as the Juarez cartel. Ultimately, the dissolution of the Guadalajara cartel would be the precursor to today's narco landscape and the wider conflict known as the Mexican Drug War, a term coined in 2006 by then Mexican President Felipe Calderón. The cartels formed out of the disbandment of the Guadalajara cartel would eventually fight tooth and nail for territory, drug routes, and influence. Initially, the fledgling Sinaloa cartel and the Tijuana cartel would go to war in the early 90s, the conflict bringing a new level of violence not seen in the Mexican narco landscape up until that point. The Sinaloa cartel, under the leadership of the likes of Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, Ismael El Mayo Zambada, and Juan Jose Esparragoza Moreno, aka El Azul, would go on to become the most influential cartel in Mexico by the time of the late 1990s. At the turn of the millennium, tensions would begin to rise between the Sinaloa cartel and the Juarez cartel. Primarily, this was partly due to the fact that once El Chapo had escaped from prison in 2001, many members of the Juarez cartel defected and went to work for El Chapo. This would cause anger within the Juarez cartel leadership. The war was inevitable. In 2004, after years of bad blood, the brother of Juarez cartel leader Vicente Carrillo Fuentes was killed, allegedly under the orders of El Chapo. Vicente would retaliate by ordering the assassination of El Chapo's brother in prison. This ignited a turf war between the two cartels, which made 2004 the deadliest and bloodiest year in recent Mexican history at that time. The war would introduce levels of hyper-violence that shocked the nation and the wider international community, with beheadings, dismemberments, and brazen displays of public violence occurring on a far too regular basis. By this time, the rulebook had been thrown out the window. Children and innocents were no longer out of bounds. Cartel de Sinaloa's war with Juarez cartel saw the introduction of heinous tactics that we still see used by cartels to this day, including recruitment by force to fight rivals. At a similar time, during the late 90s and first decade of the 2000s, the rise of the Gulf Cartel, mainly down to the ruthless effectiveness of their armed wing, Los Zetas, also changed the game for the worst. During the rise of Los Zetas, the group were not only known for their violence against rivals, but also the victimization of innocent people, from extortion of both small and large business owners to robbery and, disturbingly, kidnap, forced recruitment and human trafficking. Following the fallout between Los Zetas and the Gulf Cartel in 2010 and the subsequent war that followed, both Los Zetas and the Gulf Cartel become renowned for their cruelty and brutality against each other, but the violence and depravity wasn't just kept between the cartels, the wider public was also greatly affected. In states such as Tamaulipas, kidnap of young people skyrocketed. One of the primary reasons for this was because of the brutality of the war and the fact that both sides were losing countless men. To counteract this, both cartels resorted to kidnapping young men and children from poor families, and they were essentially used by the cartels as cannon fodder. Children as young as 12 were reported to have been kidnapped by the warring cartels. Kidnap was also rampant at this time to facilitate extortion and ransoms to fund the ongoing war between both cartels. Juan Grillo, a narco-journalist and author who appeared on Joe Rogan, relayed the story of a mother in Monterrey who had her son kidnapped by Los Zetas. The mother, along with her husband and her two sons, were chilling at home, like any other night after a long day's work, before all of a sudden, loud thuds were coming from the door, and before they knew it, the door was bust down by at least 15 heavily armed cartel members, kitted out with body armor and high-grade weaponry. They pinned the family down before stealing items and money from the household. Eventually, they asked the mother, "Which one of your sons is the oldest?" Unable to speak, the mother said nothing, before her eldest son, a philosophy student, raised his hand and admitted that he was. The cartel members simply stated, "You're coming with us," before leaving into the night with him. The next day, the mother received a phone call from the kidnappers. They had set a ransom and promised, should she pay, she will get her son back. Like any desperate mother would, she went to family, friends and associates to gather whatever money she could, and lo and behold, she managed to acquire the sum that the kidnappers were asking for. She dropped the money off at the set destination and then tried to contact the kidnappers to say that she'd paid the money. However, at this point, there was no further contact with the kidnappers. Sadly, local police were of no help to the grieving mother. She tried her best to locate her son, though she would never see him again. A few weeks after his disappearance, 49 bodies were found in Monterrey, all decapitated with their hands and feet cut off, as well as showing various signs of torture. The mother visited the morgue in an attempt to possibly identify her son as one of the victims. She closely investigated each and every body, only to find out that her son was not among them. To this day, she is still seeking closure on her son's fate. Young people have long been a target of drug cartels in Mexico, and from my research over the years, it is certainly the darkest aspect of the so-called war on drugs. Not only are young people targeted for recruitment and trafficking, but young people are very often seen as collateral damage by drug cartels. Very frequently, innocent people including kids will get caught in the crossfire of cartel shootouts, resulting in horrific injury as well as fatalities. But sometimes, young people are deliberately targeted to send a brutal message to rivals. Across the years, unfortunately, there have been many countless examples of such cases, notably involving a former Zeta leader known as El Chano, Marciano Milan Vasquez, who was responsible for the murder of at least 29 people. Milan Vasquez was a regional Zeta boss in the Mexican border town of Piedras Negras, though he was arrested in Texas in 2015 under a myriad of charges. He would eventually be sentenced to 7 consecutive life sentences in the US prison system. El Chano was also suspected to have participated in the 2010 and 2011 San Fernando massacres that resulted in the deaths of 265 people combined. During his trial in the US, the true nature of his evil was exposed, and the levels of depravity in which he was accused of shocked the jury. In one witness testimony, Marciano Milan Vasquez was said to have massacred an entire family based on a disagreement with the father. Along with his goons, he gatecrashed the home and held both the mother and father captive, forcing them to watch himself murder their 6-year-old daughter. Dismemberment was said to be his favourite method of execution, and this was how he murdered the 6-year-old girl. He cut her up, limb from limb, with an axe, in front of her mother and father. The witness told that Marciano repeatedly told the father, "You will remember me," as he was forced to watch the murder of his daughter. He then set the remains on fire, though, before leaving the property, he ordered his men to execute both the mother and the father. The graphic nature of the event shocked the jury, and it was just one of many heinous acts in which he participated in. Ever since I've started covering the drug war, the victimization of young people has been something in which I've tried to avoid, but ultimately, not talking about it would mean ignoring the most tragic aspect of Mexico's drug war. Ultimately, countless people will utter the phrase, "Recreational drug use is a victimless crime." And while we can argue in relation to the legalization of drugs and ways to mitigate what is happening in Mexico as well as in inner city areas of Western countries, the fact is, most drugs are illegal in most places as of right now, and purchasing such illicit substances funds the very organisations that we cover on the channel, ultimately sponsoring the acts in which they perpetrate. There are many uncomfortable conversations to be had that have become ultra-politicised surrounding the war on drugs, whether that be the acceptance of recreational drug use or border control. all sensibilities have gone out of the window, and polarized, dogmatic thinking has taken over, which is unfortunate and ultimately contributes to the current situation. The whole situation is dire, depressing, and there seems to be no end in sight. As we know, drug cartels are no strangers when it comes to victimizing the young, and the following case is one in which I have avoided ever since I started the channel, despite many recommending that I cover it. The case isn't for the faint of heart, and the clip in question is extremely hard to watch and is utterly depressing. But nevertheless, what happens in the actual video? The video in question goes by many titles online, and it is a relatively well-known cartel video. The working title usually goes along the lines of son of cartel boss executed by rivals. In regards to the time frame as to when the video was released, I am not 100% sure on what year it came out, but the earliest record online that I found of this case dates back to 2017. Also, the video is very often confused with another similar cartel video, which I have also not covered on this channel. Both videos show teenagers being executed by a rival gang, both of which are extremely hard to watch. One of the videos showcases the Santa Rosa de Lima cartel executing a teenager with alleged links to Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generacion, but the actual video in question has next to no backstory other than it being described as a cartel-related video. In some circles, a vague backstory has been attributed to the clip, though how true it is completely unknown. I happen to believe it to be mainly false, but the story is as follows. Allegedly, the victim in the video is the son of a cartel boss, and the execution was carried out by a rival cartel in order to send a message. Some even claim that it was recorded so that the video could be sent to the father. What cartel perpetrated the horrific act is completely unknown, and the cartel in which the victim was related to is also unknown. The whole backstory I believe to be false. I find it more likely that the young victim was probably a low-level cartel operative, such as being a lookout, and he happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. If he was the son of a well-known cartel boss or lieutenant, there would be clarity surrounding the backstory. Regardless, the video itself is exactly 2 minutes and 27 seconds in length, and the clip has been shot at the dead of night in a desolate, rural location. As you play the clip, you realised that the sound is messed up. You hear background wind, however, you can't hear the victim talking. The teenager can be seen kneeling on the ground, and he seems to have his hands tied behind his back. He has also been severely beaten off camera. One of his eyes has become so bruised that it is swollen shut. A Sicario is standing behind him, and he is holding the victim's hair, propping his head up to look at the camera. You can see the victim speak, but you cannot hear what he is saying, so no clues can be gathered from the brief interrogation. The Sicario behind him stands ominously as he carries a combat knife in his other hand. The poor victim looks utterly terrified as he sits, waiting for his fate. Out of nowhere, 20 or so seconds into the video, the Sicario violently pulls the victim by the hair, which causes the teen to panic. He then takes the combat knife, which has serrated teeth, and starts to cut him on his trachea. Immediately, the victim is pulled to the floor and put onto his side. The killer, with a blade, then cuts through the trachea as the victim grimaces his teeth in pain. Blood begins to soak the soil, and the blade cuts through the windpipe like a hot knife through butter. All of a sudden, you then start to hear sound, although it is very distorted. I think the person filming on the mobile phone may have had his finger over the microphone. You hear the sounds of laboured breathing and the sounds of blood squelching. The sound is cutting in and out. You also hear a few groans. After a few seconds, the serrated blade has cut through the trachea, and the victim has essentially been half decapitated. However, you still see him trying to move, and he continues to grit his teeth in pain. The hitman then cuts around the back and side of the neck, and you see the white of his spinal cord. It's utterly grim, but the sound then suddenly gets louder and you hear horrific sounds coming from the victim. The sounds in such videos are hard to explain, but it sounds like extremely violent snoring mixed with the sounds of gushing and bubbling blood. When the victim tries to breathe, it makes a sound akin to a noise a straw makes when trying to suck out small amounts of liquid from a cup. It's hard to explain, but it's a raspy, wheezing, bubbling sound. The killer has a tough time initially cutting through the spinal cord, so he essentially takes the knife and lines the tip of the blade onto the spinal cord, and he then starts to use the palm of his hand to hammer the knife into the spine. You hear it crunch as it happens. The spinal cord has been partially severed, and the killer then takes the serrated side of the blade, which has large teeth, and he begins to saw through the rest of the spine. It creates a horrible grinding and clicking sound. You also now hear chitter-chatter in the background from a few sicarios. However, unlike the majority of cartel videos, the sicarios are quiet and whispering, and sound very subdued. They are not talking that much. Possibly, the horrific nature of the act is even extreme for them, given the age of the victim. The beheading is then complete. The sicario holds the head up to the camera with one hand, holding it by the hair, but the person filming seems to tell him to turn the head around so that the face is in front of the camera. The lifeless look on the severed head is haunting, as you see blood drip to the ground. The person filming then motions for the man to put the head down, which he does gently by resting it next to the corpse. The identity of the victim is unknown, as is his age, but I'd guess he is around 14, which makes this case utterly shocking. Weirdly, even the behaviour from the sicarios wasn't the same as we usually see in cartel videos. There was none of the hype talk or drug-fueled rants, but just quiet murmurings and whispers. People have asked for this clip to be covered for quite some time, due to its shocking nature. Due to obvious reasons, it is a hard watch, but ultimately, it serves as a reminder of the reality of drug cartels in Mexico. Nobody is out of bounds, and nobody is safe. But anyway, that is the video. I hope you enjoyed it, if you can enjoy this sort of content. This one was a bit of a rough one. Pretty hard to record, to be honest, but ultimately, like I was saying, it is the reality of the Mexican drug war right now, and it has been that way, you know, ever since the turn of the millennium, so we're still in the same position. But anyway, as always guys, thanks for support, much appreciated. Links will be in the pinned comment, all of that good stuff, Twitter, etc. Twitch, if you could follow, that would be amazing. But anyway guys, I'm going to wrap it up. As always, stay safe, and I'll catch you on the next one.